So, friends, it's an important talk for me today, and the subject is the journey of the soul. And woven into this talk, there is a story that I will be telling that includes many of you here, a story that began 30 years ago when I gave my first talk in America, just down the road at the Esalen Center, on the subject of the mystic marriage, which is this very mysterious inner union of masculine and feminine, out of which the child of the self or the child of the soul is born, that extraordinary, deepest miracle that really belongs to being a human being. And that is woven into this whole talk I will give about the journey of the soul. First of all, just to clear up any misunderstanding, you do not have a soul. You are a soul. You are a soul that has come into a body. It comes in at 3 months into the fetus. Seen it happen. 3 months the soul is present in the fetus, and then in the first 2 years it develops this very mysterious thing called an I. Later translated into an ego that becomes anything from the terrible twos to the teenager to the angst of the adult. And I think the greatest mystery really is not that we are a soul, but that we forget that we are a soul. How that happens, I have absolutely no idea, or why it happens. It's the greatest mystery. I had my first direct experience, in fact the only one I've ever had in this life, of what it really means to be a soul. And I saw it when I was 23, and saw a group of young children going to the park. And in those days in England, when children went to the park from school, they used to do it in crocodile fashion, everybody holding on to a partner. So there was this little crocodile of young children. They must have been 5 or 6 years old. And where the heart was in each of these young children, there was the most amazing, brilliant sun. It was incredibly beautiful. It was so bright, I could only see it for a few moments before the veils came down. And that's what we really are. We are this incredible, bright, luminous being, energy, love, call it what you will. And that's how we come into this world, and that's our real nature. And the journey of the soul concerns the journey of that luminous light in this world. And that has always been my passion, my deepest interest, what really concerns me, because to me that is what matters, is the journey of the soul, of this light. And as I say, there is at the beginning this whole mystery of forgetting. We forget our divine nature. Usually by about the time you are 4 or 5, the veils of this world close you off. This journey of forgetfulness, what the Sufis call the journey from God. And say, to me, that is really the greatest mystery. How can we forget what we really are and then go through this whole journey, if we are drawn to go on this journey, to rediscover it? And just so you have a kind of groundwork to begin on, for me the best description of the soul or the self was written 2,500 years ago in the Katha Upanishad. And just a little extract from this. When it calls the soul or self Atma, it's the same. That boundless power, source of every power, manifesting itself as life, entering every heart, living there among the elements, that is self. That person no bigger than a thumb, burning like flame without smoke, maker of past and future, the same tomorrow as today, that is self. And that is who we are. That is our real nature. And this extraordinary being, as I said, comes into this world to have experiences in this world, and if the gods are kind, to go home in this world. And for those experiences, it needs a body, it needs a separate identity, this I that we develop, but the real experience belongs to the soul. Everything else passes, everything else is just Maya, just this play of illusion in this stage of the world. So I'm going to explore different levels of experience of the soul. And as I say, woven into this is another story which I will come back to from time to time, which is really the deepest mystery of the soul in this incarnation. Now, for most people, the soul remains as if asleep. Again, to go back to the Upanishads, there's a simple line there. Two birds sat on the branch of the tree. One ate the fruit of the tree, the other looked on. And so there is the part of you that engages in life, that eats the fruit of the tree, that is drawn into desire, that is drawn into what the Taoists call the 10,000 things, which I think now have become the 10 million things. And then there is the deeper part of oneself that doesn't engage, that just watches, looks on. And this is the most mysterious relationship between those two parts, between the person whom you think you are, who you grow up to believe you are, and this being that you really are. And to me, what matters most is how can this experience in life be the most meaningful experience for the soul, so that something actually happens. It is not just another dream, not just a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, for most people, as I say, by the time you are 4 or 5, you've forgotten you have a soul, you've entered into this world, you have the experiences of this world, and the soul is either asleep or just elsewhere, not fully present, not fully awake. And yet its light is inside of you. And for most people, this is their conscience. And in this world, in the journey through this world, you have choices. The light of the soul that incarnates in you gives you choices. This is the fire stolen from the gods. This is the human destiny played out for most people. And I'm not talking so much about simple good and bad, but in your life there are choices. There are choices towards compassion. There are choices towards empathy. There are choices towards kindness. There are choices towards forgiveness. There are choices towards generosity. And there are similarly also choices towards greed, choices towards desire, choices towards lust, choices towards the me, the self-centered grip of this world. And together with that, there is all the shadows of this world, which one sees only too sadly played out on the stage around us in the world. I was reading today about the Rohingya and the women who'd been tied up against a tree and raped and raped and raped. That is the darkness of this world that grips the human being and in a way strips them of their light. And this is the play of light and dark that is played out in this world for many people. And I hate to say it, there are consequences. We seem to live in a culture that doesn't really believe in consequences, and I'm not talking here about heaven and hell, because that is in a way too simplistic. But from a purely scientific point of view, what happens as you turn towards the lower nature, towards the desires, towards the me, towards greed, towards a certain lack of care, lack of empathy, is that the light of the soul becomes less and less accessible. This is the drama of light and dark in the human being. As you are caught more in the grip of the darkness of this world, your own light becomes less and less accessible. Until finally there's this great tragedy when a certain humanity gets lost, and a certain care gets lost, and a certain empathy gets lost, and a certain coldness takes over. And then there is what happens. The soul becomes lost. The soul no longer has access to the light of its divine nature. This is a very deep, profound, esoteric tragedy. And sadly, one can see this being played out on the world stage more and more at this time. There is a certain darkness that takes the light of humanity, that does not care about the crying of the child. And on the other side, the more you live with care, with compassion, with generosity, the more you are given access to your own divine nature, and the more you have access to kindness and love and care and generosity. So that, for most people, is the drama as it's played out today. Now, I want to give you a little bit of, again, history of the soul. Because, again, what matters is that the soul has a meaningful experience in this world. Because, as John Lennon said, last night the wife said, you know, when you're dead, you don't take nothing with you but your soul. Right? And so what really matters is what experience does the soul have. And you'd be surprised at what the soul is not interested in. It doesn't matter what car you have. It doesn't care if you are rich or poor, if you have a big house or a little house. It has other deeper concerns. Now, as far as I can understand, going back in history, and I want to put this in a historical context, because in the early days, the soul was nourished directly by our relationship to the sacred in creation. In the early days, when human consciousness was waking up on this planet, when the world was full of magic and wonder and beauty and colors, and when the world was alive with the grandeur of God, then the soul was nourished by experiencing this sacred wonder of creation. And humanity developed rituals to bring the soul into conversation with the earth and what is sacred within the earth. And it developed songs, and it developed music, and it developed even initiations to take the human being and their experience, to take it into this deeper meeting of the sacred within the human being and the sacred within the earth. It was a very beautiful time, and the earth sang, and the names of God were alive, and the magic ran like rivers. And that's how it was for thousands of years, in which the soul celebrated its experience in this world through the sacred within creation. The beauty of the rainbow or the buffalo, in all its myriad forms, there was this meeting between the light within the human being and the light within the world. Lumen naturae, the light within nature, and the lumen Dei, the light within the human being. And there are still traces of that in some of the indigenous cultures. And that is how the soul journeyed through this world and became nourished by its experience of this world. It was a very, very beautiful time. Some of us have ancestral memories of those times. And then things changed because evolution moves forward, and the evolution of the soul moved forward. And then God was no longer just in the earth, just in the butterflies and the bees and the birds and the rivers and the mountains and the forests. God began to be found in the heavens. And there became this rise of monotheism, of a God who is no longer caught in creation, but is beyond creation, is in heaven rather than in the earth. And once again, the soul began to meet creation in a slightly different way. It began to have... when something is meaningful to the soul, it has a numinous quality. It has a special energy. It's like you can have a numinous dream and the soul is present in it. Now, if you look back at the early days and you look back at the cave paintings in southern France, one of the first forms of artistic expression that we can resonate with, they have this numinosity, they have this other quality. It is not just a buffalo or a horse that is painted, it is a sacred buffalo or a horse, and it has an energy that belongs to what is sacred. And you can see how that was part of the life of the people of the time. They left this record, a few traces of that extraordinary vibrancy, sacred beauty. And this became slowly transformed into the symbols of religion, into the rituals that became wound and woven around this monotheistic spirituality, this God is in heaven. And you can again still see traces of it. I think if it is very potent in the Christian Mass, if it is really lived as a sacred symbol, the blood and the wine, the body of Christ. This is, the soul becomes incarnate in that moment. The soul gives meaning to life in this ritual. And there are many different rituals in many different parts of the world to do also with sacred art, which again became woven into the culture of humanity. As I say, it's also woven into art. I used to study sacred architecture, and I often think what it would have been like for a medieval man who lived in a 2-room hut with the animals on one side and his family on the other, and an earth floor, to go on a Sunday into Chartres Cathedral and to look up at this extraordinary ceiling hundreds of feet above, and to see the stained glass and the colors coming through and the maze on the floor, and suddenly the symbolic world, the numinous world, was present all around him, and his soul was nourished. Her soul was touched. And this something met, something in the soul, and the journey of the soul had meaning. It was not just a struggle for survival, but there was this numinous meeting with the soul, and the journey of the soul got a spark of consciousness, a spark of life. And yet, as I said, one of the great mysteries of the human being is we forget. We forget and we forget and we forget. And just like the sacred within creation was forgotten, in the last centuries the power and potency of these rituals became also forgotten, covered over, veiled, however you like to call it. And what you see now is usually just a trace of a mystery that was once present. And so what we are left with today, as I said, for most of us, particularly if we live in cities, the sacred within creation, within the rainbow and the storm and the stream and the forest, is hidden. And for most of us in our secular lives, the power of those early rituals We are no longer in awe. Our soul no longer speaks to us in those rituals in the same way. And in a way, what we are left with is something much simpler, something that actually was a central part of the Christian mystery as it came into the world, which is the simple quality of human love. And I think for most of us today, this is where the soul is waiting to be spoken to. It can be heard. It is the same because it is a relationship. In the simple human love, that meeting of people in which the heart is open, in which there is feeling, in which there is compassion. And this is to learn the lessons of love is the central note of the soul at this time, this human message of love. And this is why today, for example, what is happening at the border in this country with South America speaks so potently to so many people, because it is a simple message of love and care that is woven into love, on compassion that is woven into love. And this is when the soul is present today, there is love. And when there is no love, there is no soul. The soul has gone to sleep. The soul has faded away. There is just the debris of this world. And then, again, to go back to this quotation from Shakespeare, from Macbeth. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. If there is not love, it's also, of course, in St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, if there is not love. And so, yes, there was a time when the soul communicated with the sacred in creation, and humanity's rituals were about the sacred in creation. And then, as the soul evolved, as humanity evolved, it was given a glimpse of another aspect of the divine, this transcendent divine, this extraordinary light that does not belong to creation. And so humanity worshipped this light, and the soul was again given a quality of meaning in its journey through life, in the rituals of the time. And now that is faded, and we are left with something essentially human, deeply human. I think that is one of the core aspects of Christ's message, Christ's incarnation into the human being of divine love. So this is just a picture of the way the soul, for most people, journeys through life. And as I say, for me, more and more it is about the journey towards love. So, many years ago, my teacher, Irina Tweedy, was being interviewed by a young person for a German newspaper, and the friend of mine who was present was very surprised because she didn't talk about her time with her teacher in India. She talked about her life before the war when she lived in a hotel in Switzerland, and she danced every night. And then she went to Italy and she worked for a fashion magazine. And my friend thought, why is she saying that? And then at the end of the interview, she said to this young man, "Now, you young man, you go off. And you go home and you make love to your wife and you drink beer with your friends and you play with your children." And she said, "And then one day you will wake up and you will say, there must be more to life than this. And then the mystery of the soul begins." And that is this extraordinary spiritual turning point. Rumi says it in the same way. He says, in the end, a person tires of everything except heart's desiring, soul's journeying. I'll repeat that. In the end, a person tires of everything except heart's desiring, soul's journeying. Now, to put it in the bigger picture, the soul comes into this world lifetime after lifetime, experience after experience, as a woman, as a man, as rich, as poor, as mother, as father, as child, as daughter, as hungry, as everything. And then one day, in the end, one tires of that and one says, there must be more to life than this. And this is traditionally the moment of awakening. The Sufis call it tauba, the turning of the heart. And what is important, and all of you have had this experience, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You would be in Walmart, you would be watching the football, you would be doing the 10,000 things. You've all had this moment at some point when something in you woke up. And it is always an act of grace. In fact, the great Sufi Rabia, who was really born into slavery and lived this extraordinary life of devotion to her beloved, she was asked by Hassan of Basra, another great Sufi, he said, if I renounce the world and turn towards God, will God turn towards me? And she said, no, never. First, God turns towards you, and then you turn towards God. So the moment you have this experience, you are in a state of grace. After how many lifetimes? Something in you is woken up. This is one of the great mysteries of the soul. It is always an act of grace. And then the journey of the soul takes on a whole different vibration, a whole different frequency. Then there comes the possibility of a conscious relationship between you, who you think you are, and your soul. Or God. In a way, for most people, our soul, this extraordinary light we have within us, this quality of pure love, that is our Father in heaven. That is the divine for us. And when this moment happens, there is a whole different spectrum of consciousness accessible to us. I remember when it happened to me when I was 16, and suddenly I saw colors I'd never seen before. Suddenly this gray world turned into a world full of color and beauty, and there was light above everything, and everything sang, and there was music, and outwardly I was still in the same boring boarding school, but it was completely different, because this spark had come from the soul into my life. And this is when traditionally the journey to God begins. As I said, the Sufi says there are three journeys. A journey from God, which is this journey of forgetfulness, in which we forget who we are, what we are. We forget this light that is our own soul. And then, in this moment of grace, we are given a glimpse of it. It is unbelievable. As I say, all of you have had it at some point. It can be just looking up at the stars at night. It can have been in prayer. Whatever. And then you begin to look for the light. And then you begin to find prayers, practices to help you to connect with your soul, so there can be a relationship between you and your soul. And this is what in the West is known as spiritual life. And in my own lifetime, I saw many, many different techniques, ways, paths come to the West from the East that weren't there when I was born. Ways to live this spark, ways to connect with your own soul, whether through meditation or prayer or chanting or mindfulness, these many, many ways. And you find a way, you find a prayer. There is a saying, every human being has his own way of prayer and glorification. We find a prayer that suits us. We find a spiritual technique that helps us to connect with our soul. And then the soul begins to give us its gifts. And this is one of the miracles of waking up. It's like suddenly life becomes more meaningful, it becomes richer, we have different values, we find peace, or all of the qualities of the soul, or love, or bliss, or they come into our life, the gift of the soul, because that is the nature of the soul. And it's extraordinary when that happens at the beginning. It is really unbelievable. Whether it's stillness, or just an awareness of beauty, or quality of silence, it's so many different qualities of the soul. And as I say, in the 60s and then in the 70s, as many of these paths, these traditions in the East came to the West, there were different ways to access the soul, to bring the soul into one's life. So this journey of the soul could have a whole different spectrum of consciousness. And I was drawn to silent meditation. That's what resonated with me. That's what allowed my soul to speak to me. Now there is, and I gave a whole talk about this last year, so I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but sadly there has been a deep misunderstanding about this in the West. And it has to do in the way in which our consumer culture took over the gifts of the soul, in which so many of these techniques, these practices, have become sold, have become marketed into what can I get? How can my life become more meaningful? How can I have a better life through this connection to my soul? There's nothing wrong with having a better life, but there is a danger. Because, and I give you two different stories about it. One is this ancient story in the West, which is the Grail Myth. And the Grail Myth is really the central Western spiritual myth. The Grail is the grace, the energy of the soul. And when Sir Galahad gets given the Grail and finds himself in the Grail Castle, he doesn't ask the question, and the castle vanishes. And he has to wander for many years. And it is a very simple question. And the question is, for whom serves the Grail? And the answer is, the Grail serves the Grail King. And all of those gifts of the soul that are now marketed in today's spiritual marketplace, silence, stillness, peace, whatever you like, they are given so you can make a better relationship with the soul, not so you can get a better life. It's not business class on a spiritual journey. It's very, very simple, but somehow that was one of the instructions that didn't make it to the West. And the gift of the soul, this awakening, is supposed to foster a relationship between you and your own soul. So the soul can begin to guide you through life, can begin to become part of your life. As Tweedy used to say, the goal of every path of yoga is to lead a guided life, guided within by that which is eternal. And if you take it for yourself, then you've lost that connection. If you use it as a way to be with the soul, then the soul comes into your life. It's very simple. And again, to quote Rabia, because she is such an inspiration, she lived 1,000 years ago. And she said, I do not work like a labourer in expectation of wages, thou art enough for me. I do not work like a labourer in expectation of wages. We don't do this to get something. And if those of you who want to explore the danger of this further, what actually happens when you use this gift of the soul, these gifts of the soul for your own personal well-being, is you create something called a spiritual ego. You're no longer your ordinary self, you're your spiritual self. And that looks good, but actually cuts you off from any long-term relationship with your soul, and your soul, any chance of your soul having a long-term relationship with you in this life. And many people think they have a relationship with their self or their soul, but they actually just have this spiritualized ego. And so the gift that was given, this gift of awakening, this tauba, this turning of the heart, this magical mystery, this grace, is lost for that lifetime. Okay. But if it isn't lost, if you work with it, if you realize the real nature of the gift you are given, then the soul can be more present in your life. And then you live what is called a spiritual life. And the soul also has a more meaningful journey in this life. It's no longer just Maya. There is a communication. There is a communion. And that's why I love these practices of listening prayer, of inner receptivity. This prayer of stillness. Like St. Teresa of Avila practiced. That go into a deepening relationship with the divine, with the soul within you. I think that's a wonderful way to live spiritual life. This communion, it's a real communion of yourself and your soul. Okay. Now there is, as I said, another story. And this is a story I was asked to tell in the West, and for some reason it has been hidden in the West. And as I say, part of the story that I've been asked to live in the last 30 years was to try to make this story more known in the West. And this has to do with the whole tradition of the complete transformation of the human being, in which the soul becomes incarnated within the human being, in which it is not just a relationship of you and your soul, but your soul comes and lives within you. And I think this was present in the first 2 centuries of Christianity. And it's a central theme of Christ and his disciples, this birth into human consciousness of the Christ principle, of the soul, of the divine. And then, as you know, in the early years of the church, the bishops made a decision to ban esoteric practices, and it got lost. It's still present in some of the Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but it was banned by the church. They wanted worldly power rather than spiritual experiences, and then the Inquisition finally delivered its death blow. There were the Cathars and people who had some of these esoteric practices. Now, what I want to say from the beginning, and this is a whole different dimension of the soul's journey. And the Sufi says you have to be a bit crazy to go here. That's why the Sufis are called idiots of God. It is about the complete transformation of the human being. It is about the awakening into human consciousness of the consciousness of the soul. I am he whom I love, he whom I love is me. Now, you can't buy this in the marketplace. You can't get this at the bookstore. You can't get it on an audio tape. Don't have tapes anymore, whatever it is. This has to do with the certain esoteric practices. Now, to be clear, if you read the Katha Upanishad, written 2,500 years ago, it tells you about it. And it tells you how to bring the soul, the Atma, into consciousness. Because it has always been part of our human destiny to be given this opportunity to fully incarnate the soul into human consciousness. And from the very beginning, the masters, the great ones, those who look after the spiritual destiny of humanity, have given practices and techniques to enable this to happen. And it could be found in ashrams in India. The first time I consciously came across it was when I was 17 and I read a book called The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is a Taoist text. And it describes in detail how you create a body of light with certain breathing practices. And something in me immediately recognized, yes, this has to do with the complete spiritual transformation of the human being. And yet, it is interesting because when many of the spiritual traditions came to the West in the 60s and 70s, this inner core of teaching was passed over in most cases. And yet it is the essence of the soul's journey, to become a living presence. There is a beautiful little saying again by Rumi, "My heart is light upon light, a beautiful Mary with Jesus in the womb." My heart is light upon light, a beautiful Mary with Jesus in the womb. And that Jesus in the womb is the divine self that is brought into incarnation within the human being. And light upon light has to do with the whole Sufi mystery of how this takes place. Light rises towards light and light comes down upon light, and it is light upon light. Now, as I say, part of my work has been to weave this story back into the consciousness of our culture for 30 years now, so that it is present. It's like a thread. You can weave something into the consciousness. Maybe nobody hears about it, but maybe in 100 years' time, that thread is still present. And because that is what drew me. Yes, it is wonderful to have this connection with one's soul, to be able to go into prayer and be nourished and speak to your soul. But for me, it was never enough. I wanted more. And so I found myself at the feet of my teacher, who had been trained in that way. And I was also given the teachings to pass on, to give that experience or make that experience accessible to others. Now, I will give you some details about how this is done. And there are ingredients you need for this stage of the soul's journey, for this incarnation of the self. First of all, you need an energy or a power source. You don't have enough on your own. And in different traditions, they get access to different power sources. For example, in Taoism, and I've studied Taoism, you access the Tao, that energy within life that on a lower plane is Qi energy. Maybe some of you have practiced Tai Chi or Qigong. That is its lower level. But the Taoist masters of old used the energy of the Tao, and they used breathing practices and visualizations to create this body of light, so that the Tao could become fully present within the sage, within the master. Very few traces of that left. In Buddhism, in my experience, they preferred to use the energy of pure consciousness or empty mind. And again, you work with it, with practices, with meditations, with visualizations. It's a very intense practice. It takes many years. And out of that, you create what is called the diamond body, your own immortal self, the self, or your Buddha nature. You realize your Buddha nature. You become your Buddha nature. But you need a power source, and that's what they work with, the light of pure consciousness. Incredibly beautiful light. In fact, some people in our group who've done that practice in past lives, they have it present in the spiritual centers. Very beautiful light. Sufis use the energy of love. Love is the greatest power in creation, and Sufis use the energy of love. And the love is given. And this is where it gets a little complicated to understand in the West, because it is given through this teacher-disciple relationship that has always been at the core of Sufism. That the teacher gives the love that the disciple needs to transform directly into the heart of the disciple. In our particular tradition, it's done through this bond of love called rabita that is made between the heart of the teacher and the heart of the disciple. You make a bond, rabita. It's a connection, esoteric connection. And through that connection, you transmit love. And it goes directly into the spiritual body of the disciple, of the wayfarer, and that gives them enough energy to transform. That is given. It's an act of grace. So first of all, you need a power, you need an energy. And as I say in the tradition I work in, that's really what I can describe and share in depth. That's how it's done. You give love. Love is an energy, love is a tremendous power. And it's given, and you put it into the heart of the student. All right? The second thing you need is you need instructions. How do you use this energy? So I say the Taoist instructions in the Book of the Golden Flower, very simple. And part of my work was to translate the instructions from the texts in Sufism into contemporary English. And I spent 20 years doing that. How do you work with love? It's not something that belongs to our Western canon at all. I'm amazed at how St. Teresa of Avila did it when she wasn't even allowed to practice silent prayer because of the Inquisition. She did it, the stages of prayer. Unbelievable. She was a great master. But otherwise, it is not part of our Western canon. How do you work with love? And there are different ways you need to work with love. It is not complicated, but it's an exact science. This is this final aspect of the journey of the soul. It's an exact science. Again, you must remember that from the very beginning, go back to the Katha Upanishad, great spiritual masters have given these techniques to humanity to enable humanity to make this journey of the soul, to complete this circle of love. And in our tradition, the love is given, then you have to work with the love. And we have certain practices like meditation, and there are also principles of the path that we follow. One is the remembrance of the heart. You are present within your heart at all times. And then there are qualities of character you need to develop to live with this love, like patience. You have to learn patience. I have spoken about this for many years. So this is part of the story of love that I have been articulating for the last 30 years. And so there is the energy, there is the instructions, and then there is the container. And this is very important. The alchemists, who are kind of have a vestige of this in the Western tradition, speak about the vase beniclausum, the well-sealed vessel. You need to contain it. You're transforming your whole being. You're turning lead into gold. And it needs to be contained, otherwise things come in that disturb the process. There needs to be an energetic container. Just being vegetarian doesn't cut it. And in fact, the last 2 lots of talks I gave, one is what's called the container for love, and the other was a special talk I gave a year ago, which is spiritual guidance for living in toxic times, because I saw how present toxicity was coming into this container. So you need a container. Now, one aspect of the container is your own practice. If you do the practices right, if you do, on our path, the remembrance of God, the zikr, the meditation, if you live in the right way, that creates a container. But that isn't enough, because that's you. And traditionally in our path, the real container was satsang, sitting in the presence of the teacher. In the presence of the teacher, there is an energy field that contains this whole process. In fact, for the first 10 years after I met my teacher, I wasn't allowed to read any books, and there were no teachings about this path. We just did a meditation, and I just sat at her feet once or twice a week. That's the tradition, and she brought that tradition from India, where her teacher's disciples just sat in satsang, being in the presence of the teacher. And that's how it was with the teacher before, and how it was with the teacher before that. That creates an energy field, which is needed for this extraordinary transformation of the human being. Remember, we're doing the most almost completely impossible thing of giving birth to the soul within human consciousness. So you become fully conscious of your divine nature before you die. So you give birth. The Sufis have this expression, it takes time to make a soul pregnant with God. That is part of this process. It's like, so he said, light upon light, beautiful Mary with Jesus in the womb. So, traditionally, that container is being in the presence of the teacher, right? But there is a problem about that. That I experienced in my lifetime, which was my teacher's room could only hold about 40 people. And so this particular path decided to have an experiment. And with her teacher, there were only, if you look at photographs of people sitting with him, there were only 20 people. I think once a year there were like 100 people came to the Bandhara. And that was fine when I first knew Mrs. Tweedy, and there were just a few of us, 10 of us, 20, 30. And then she wrote a book, and she moved into my house. Me and my wife Annette lived upstairs looking after her. And suddenly more people came to the door, and they came from different parts of the world. And so there was a plan to create a bigger container. And the plan was to create an energy field that would contain all of the community on this path. And about 10 years ago, we maxed out at about 800 souls, as many as I could look after in this life. And there was they have different meditation groups in different parts of America and different parts of the world. And there needs to be a container, and so I created, starting 40 years ago in my teacher's house, and then in the last 30 years, created an energy container, which many of you who follow this path here have experienced, which is wherever you are in the world, you're connected to this path, you are in an energy container. And that has worked well enough up till now, but now the instructions have changed. And that energy field has now been taken away. And I explain a little bit is that when you were sitting in the presence of your teacher and you sat with him for maybe, or her, for maybe 5 or 6 years, 7 years, and then, hey, time to move on, get on with your life. And you'd be sent back into the world, and you'd have to live your own practice in the world, in your life. And maybe you'd see the teacher once every year, a couple of years. But you were no longer held in that energy field. You had to own your own practice yourself. And that worked if you were the teacher was in a little town in India, and people came and sat in his courtyard and then went off. But it hasn't quite worked in the same way if there are 800 people all over the world going through this, or being given the potential to go through this inner transformation. And so I kind of hung on for as long as I could, but I was made aware recently that everybody has been given what they need. They've all been given the love they need, and there are the instructions. There are more instructions than you can read now. All the books and talks I've given, how to live this love. I say even in the era of Trump, there was an extra footnote. My best-selling talk ever, Spiritual Guidance for Living in Toxic Times, right? And the container then just remains the container of your own practice. And that's how it's going to be from now on. So that experiment of expanding the small number of people who could sit in satsang with their teacher to, say, these 800 souls, that is over. And it's really important. There are many of you here who followed this path, and it's really important that that is impressed into your consciousness, and you don't try to recreate it. You don't try to go back, because it means you have what you need. You've been given what you need. The job of the teacher is to give the student, the disciple, what they need. Again, this is something that is not really understood in the West, because spiritual teachers are people who write books or stay on stage, and there is little understanding of this very intimate inner connection, and it was present in Christianity at the beginning. You can see it in the relationship between Christ and his disciples. That incredibly moving meeting of Mary with Christ in the garden after the empty tomb, when she mistook him for a gardener. And he said, "Woman, why weepest thou?" And then suddenly she saw who he was. And she said, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And I think, say, this esoteric tradition was present in Christianity in the small groups that came after Christ. But then it got lost. Like many things, it got lost. But it is the most extraordinary thing that can happen to you. As I said at the beginning, in the journey of the soul is really somewhere else, and it can have a meaningful experience in this life, or a few meaningful experiences. As I said, first through relationship with the sacred, and then the numinosity of religious ritual, symbolism, art. And then in today's world, really just through love, through kindness, through compassion. That is where the soul is present. And then there is this step in evolution, this waking up, this moment of grace, that you can then begin to have a relationship with the soul. And the soul can have a relationship with you, and the soul can be nourished in hidden ways if you respect it, if you realize what you have been given. The Grail serves the Grail King. And then there is this further step, this completion of the journey of the soul, this extraordinary story of the soul being born within the heart, coming alive within the heart, becoming fully conscious in this life, no longer the light you meet at the end of the tunnel when you die, but awake in your own eyes. That is really the greatest mystery of being a human being. I don't see what more could be that you become, you can say one with God, but that is a bit grandiose. Yes, you are one with your divine nature. Your divine nature is one with you, and it is alive within you. There is a saying, "My servant ceases not to draw nigh unto me with works of devotion until I love him. And when I love him, I am the eyes by which he sees, the ears by which he hears." The divine becomes fully present in your life. The circle of love has been completed. And so this has always been part of human history. It's been very hidden and yet known about in the East. In the monasteries of Tibet, in the temples in China, in the Chanukas of the Sufis. And part of my work is why I said it's a story that began 30 years ago. This first talk I gave about the mystic marriage, because that is where it begins, this mystical marriage within the human being, is to bring that story into today's consciousness, that it isn't forgotten. So many things are forgotten. We live in a time when so much is forgotten, and so its thread is woven into the tapestry of life. This possibility that the human soul can wake up within a human being, that the divine can become alive, and the light of the soul then shines through the eyes of the human being, and that light that I saw in those little children becomes a living presence within you. Not something you read in books, but something that is your friend, your companion, your lover, your guide, you, because it's you. It all goes back to what you really are, and that you can break down the barriers of separation, break down the barriers of forgetfulness, and incarnate the mystery of who you really are, this seed within the soul that contains all of the stars and all of the sunsets and all of the sunrises, and I could go on and on because... And that you take with you, friends. That doesn't get left behind at the doorway to the next world. That is the completion of the circle of love. That is the greatest story of the human being, even if it is hardly ever heard. And so for those of you who are here who are following this path, I have given you what you need, use it. My journey is moving on. But you all have what you need. Somebody wrote to me just today, they had heard about what I was saying, and I said, you have been given the love and the light you need, now live it. It can take you to God, it can take you deep within yourself, to this mystery of what it really means to be a human being, because that is the journey of the soul, is the journey of the human being. This is the privilege of being a human being. Animals are incredibly beautiful, they don't have it. This is the privilege of being a human being, to have the possibility for the soul to come alive within your own heart, for it to become a living presence, the living presence in your life.